triangles. They put them together with the squares from the coast, the middle class, and with the inland area, those groups, and they ran the government for a month. Now the whole thing was the council. They picked them by lot, incidentally. The Athenian system was an elected democracy, but there was a little twist to it. They elected the officials to a certain group, and then they picked them by lot. That way they could try to get by the idea of bribing and so on, all those other things that have affected modern election. So the whole council met a certain number of times a month. If you add up the figures, these are called the Balutic quotas. It was representation according to population. Everybody knows marathon. In the upper right corner, there's a square. It should be like green. It's not coming out very well. With 10. It had 10 representatives. And the total of their parliament was 500. And each color represents 50. So they picked them by lot. One of them took the first month of the year, then a 10-month year. Then they picked by lot the next one, and so on, and they ran the government. 4 or 5 times a month, the whole council met, but on a daily basis, you have one of these groups, red, for instance, 1 month, yellow for another month, and so on, ran the government. It was even more precise than that. They ran it on a 24-hour schedule, and 1/3 was in power each 8 hours. You'll notice that the 50 does not divide up by thirds into interval numbers, and so you'll find a few places where it's a 3-2 alternation. It was a very precise system. It was very complex. Incidentally, the military was reformed at the same time as the political system, and the military was based on this. The system was called democracy. It lasted about 1,000 years, and it set the record, and that is what we have represented in front of us here. I'm going to go back and show how data analytics and data visualization has affected the Athenians project and give you a little bit more background. We've been doing this for quite a few years. I've been at this university. It's 60 years now, around way too long. They can't find any other idiot to teach certain courses, and so by bribe or by threat, and so I'm still teaching 200 students scientific terminology each year. People used to ask me, and we used to have to justify it. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing something that's so useless? Why do people spend money on that? Why do you waste time on something which has no practical purpose? And I respond, first of all, that in Aristotle's words, a person by nature desires to know. That itself should be sufficient, but it was never sufficient. And so I'd say, I'm trying to find a cure for cancer. We just heard Serene's wonderful lecture a few minutes ago, and so on. And I would justify it like this. If we could capture the ability, the achievement of this ancient society, Athens was only 150,000 people, but the size of Oshawa or St. Catherine's. And yet it achieved everything it touched, it perfected. Whether it was mathematics, whatever branch of science, whether it was sculpture, whether it was art, whether it was jewelry, whether it was numismatics, whether it was architecture, and so on. Everything they perfected. And it's a small population which is doing all of this. If we could imitate their achievement intellectually in this period of antiquity, the highest achievement, I think, of any population, certainly per capita in history, we would have a cure for cancer immediately. Whatever they did, they accomplished, and they accomplished very well, and they excelled. It was a pursuit of excellence, and the Greek word is arete for that excellence. How much was accomplished by so few? I'm just going to mention a couple of things in passing and then move on to what the Athenians project is doing. I single out, because we're in the Fields Institute for Mathematical Research, I mention Archimedes first, the excellent ancient Greek mathematician. Recently, through modern technology, we've been able to decipher the Archimedes palimpsest, The immense contributions of Archimedes to ancient mathematics are, of course, recorded in many places. But most recently, we have seen through the decipherment of the palimpsests that he had the root fundamentals of differential calculus 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz. The Antikythera device I give as a second example. This was a piece of ancient calculating machinery. It was found over 120 years ago by divers off the island of Antikythera, hence its name. But it's only explored through modern X-ray tomography in recent years. It's an elaborate and complex piece of machinery which excels in a number of aspects. One of them is the metallurgy. Years and years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I invited the tremendous late Dr. Ursula Franklin to come to our classics club, and she came and talked about not only Chinese but Greek, ancient Greek metallurgy. Wonderful lecture by a wonderful person. In machining, this was machined with complex gears. Incidentally, they had epicycles incorporated in this 2,000 years before epicycles were used and discovered in modern mechanics. It was good to about 11 decimal points in calculating, and so on. Unheard of, and so on. Yet we have it in the National Museum. I mentioned architecture. The Parthenon was so designed to compensate for the aberrations, the natural aberrations of the human eye. Now, this is a wonderful building, gifted in many ways by wonderful architects, but I doubt very much when they were designing this building they took into consideration the natural aberrations of the human eye in the construction. Blocks cut to a 10,000th of an inch and so on. The Parthenon was just part of a building complex in Athens of a half a dozen other buildings, and there were 5 other complexes similarly being carried on at the same time, and that's by a population of 150,000. Everything they touched, they excelled in. I'll mention in passing a couple of other things that I want to move on because I know my time it should not be exceeded.
You have 20 minutes.
Yep. Jewelry. I asked you to go to the Royal Ontario Museum. Most of the modern techniques were already used by the ancient Athenian craftsmen, craftspersons, and so on. Filigree, cloisonné, and so on. Look at some of those examples in our Royal Ontario Museum. I mentioned vase painting. The Athenians did this to perfection. It's unsurpassed. Recently I was in Munich and I looked at the Dionysus cup, a beautiful Kylex. They had people who specialized in shapes and people who specialized in the decoration. The decoration is beyond, what can I say, comparison in this range. We have a wonderful collection in the Royal Ontario Museum. I ask you to take a look at it. Black figure preceded red figure. Black figure, they painted the figures on. In red figure, the silhouette. It was done in silhouette. So this was a different type of artistry. And there was also a certain amount. It's not been duplicated, to my knowledge. The Democritus Center has produced a small sample which they claim to imitate the ancient process. A subtle control of the oxygen as content, as well as the temperature of these kilns, and a certain technique that we have not yet been able to duplicate. They produce thousands of these vases, and we have a nice collection in our Royal Ontario Museum. I mentioned from literature, just in passing, Greek drama, and I can tell you that people who've studied Greek drama, as I have for 60 years, still have difficulty reading a play, especially if it's something that's been found new. We need resources, we need tools. The ordinary population of Athens, every level of society, would understand this at the first hearing, but they had Mozart-like ears. I mentioned philosophy in passing, and I'll leave it at that. The 2 greatest achievements of ancient Athenian society was the perfection of writing, ancient Greek society. They didn't invent it, they simply perfected it and exported it, and the invention of democracy on this map. Now I'll go back to a little personal biography. In high school I loved mathematics and science, but also like languages, French and German and Latin, but I had no Greek. and I had heard of Greek mathematics, and I was interested in Greek mathematics. So I came to Victoria College 60 years ago. I'm still there, now still teaching, as I mentioned, to study Greek. You had to specialize in those days. I did audit classes in mathematics and studied classes in mathematics in the summer at Carleton, Ottawa, where I lived. I was in the same class as Margaret Atwood, who's received a lot of attention lately. She was in English, and we even spent a year at Harvard. She stopped after MA. They've given her a PhD later. I like to say that I have published just as much as she has, but I have published only facts, and she's published only fiction. She laughs and points out that I'm lucky to have 100 readers of my works, and she has tens of millions of hers. We'll leave it at that. And I did a PhD at AM. They are Snoopy. They use the Latin order for MA at Harvard. I did a PhD in a class of 4 in 1967. I was interested in computers from when I was a high school student in the 50s. I became even more interested because of those 4 students in my graduate class. One was David Packard, whose daddy owned 2/3 of the HP company. That was a happy coincidence, and of course we got along well, and I had a certain advantage that way. I did a dissertation that required going to Greece and studying inscriptions, and there I met Ben Merritt. Ben Merritt was like the 4th appointment at the Institute for Advanced Study. Einstein came first, then 2 mathematicians, Veblen and Alexander. Veblen did the sort of mathematics that Einstein needed to get from the special to the general theory of relativity, and so on. And Merritt was a wonderful teacher. I got to know him well. We worked together. He had been appointed head of the inscriptions, the epigraphy in the Agora, and he gave me many inscriptions to publish. Athenian inscriptions are full of names. They're a democracy. The Democrats like to see their power, and they like to see their name in print. And so we have thousands and thousands, over 100,000 people from ancient Athens we know, and we have on inscriptions. There's no other parallel to this until we come down to the 19th and 20th century. There's just simply no society that has been so interested in the personality that they will insist, and literacy, that they will have their name in print. Merritt started a catalog in 1931 of the names of people in this group. Better get myself back to the slides. And this grew over the years to about 250,000 entries. Handwritten. Here's a sample from early in Alpha. It's the Greek, of course, Greek language, and so on. And he built this up over the years, and he retired from the Institute. I spent a number of years at the Institute in 1972, and I came back to Toronto, and I brought a copy of this with me. I also brought with me an introduction by a computerist who lived in Princeton and taught at Columbia University. Michael Barnett was his name. He knew Kelly Gottlieb, and he gave me an introduction to Kelly Gottlieb, the greatest Canadian computerist who died last October at the age of 95. Just a wonderful person, so supportive and so on, and he embraced new people, young people, people who didn't know very much about computing, with an enthusiasm that was so remarkable. Well, he put at his disposal, at my disposal, Dennis Secretzis, who was his best student at that time, Greek name, Dionysius Konstantinos Secretzis, and Dennis put at his disposal 2 students, John Kornodowski and Ivor Lab. I just want to go back a little bit to this file. It was a catalog, a handwritten catalog. It really needed secretaries. It was built up by scholars, and so you have lots and lots of scholarly material in this and very little organization. The connection worked very well. I should mention, though, in almost any project in this period, there was always a German precedent. There was a German who had excelled in this 50 or 100 years earlier. And in this case, I'm going to move on and show you a picture of the German. He's on the left there. Kircher is his name. In 1901 and 1903, he produced Prosopographia Attica, written in Latin, the great works in my subject. Some of them are still written in Latin. Scholarly words. That was the influence of the Berlin Academy. Ben Merritt is the guy in the middle in that case. That goes back 82 years. We move on to my depth. I don't hesitate to mention to Empress software. These were the two students, John Kornatowski and Ivor Ladd. They are supporting my project. They're supporting other projects. And it's always good, I've learned over the years, to give credit to your benefactors whenever you can. And I do so without shame. They were designing a system at that point. We'll move on. I have a picture of John and Ivor here. I have also a picture of the 22 volumes of the Persons of Ancient Athens. Now, our system was designed from the late 60s, the early 70s, as a computer system. It was not intended for publication, but I found that just getting someone to sign a grant for a computer in those days, the early 70s, was difficult in the humanities. They thought of the computer as an enemy, and so on. I won't digress on the story. I don't have time on that line, but I will tell privately later on. We produced some volumes. That's the way I kept up with Peggy, and it went on to 22 volumes, and so on. And on the back of your handout, or the front, whichever, the non-color, the uninteresting part, I have the basic design of the Empress relational databases. Now, this was done in the 70s, so it's long out of date now, but it's still a material which we are mining with new analytical techniques and so on. So we had 15 attributes in the main relation and 7 in the reference relation and so on. We built that out. I might point out in this day we were using PDP-11s and VAX computer. You couldn't sort much. They didn't have enough power. The Canadian government bought me a Zilog with some help and so on, but even that had 2 megabytes of memory, and that was a challenge. So we paid attention, and we published volumes, and we've supported ourselves to a certain extent with those. I show you in the bottom half that the Prosopographia Attica, done by that German, his entry 387, he had 15,500 entries in 1901, 1903. We have about 120,000 now. We've added quite a few to the database. And I show you how we've transformed, which was always intended to be a computer project, into a printed copy, just the reverse of what is the normal procedure nowadays. And that is at the bottom of the page. I want to move on, and I have done enough. That's the volumes. I want to show our debt here to Nick Chercone, the late Nick Chercone, who embraced our project through Empress, and Ajunan, one of the main people sponsoring this conference, and of course Laura Zeno here, who has been a great help, has a great connection to so on. We move on, and we better move on quickly. I've given the setup that you have on the printed handout here. I've given you the way it's been transformed for the printed volumes. And now I move to one of the most famous Athenian of all, Pericles, and I've given you the page of the printed volume. This is all assembled from the databases. That goes on for 8 or 9 pages, and the relatives and so on. All of this can be searched in various shapes and ways and formats. I have now want to show you a very recent find. It's a cup. It has 7 names on it. There's 6 here. There's one on the bottom there. It was found just 3 years ago. It's got Pericles' second last line. It's got Pericles' signature on it, along with his brother in the line above. We have lots and lots of signatures. We have lots of handwriting that needs to be studied again. I'm moving on quickly now. We have a series of links that we established in this database. Now, the usual genealogical links that you could get from Ancestry.com and all those other ones that are available at 23 and so on. But we've added a lot more to these links. And so when we form stemata or family trees, we can have members of the same philosophical school, on the same gravestone, and so on. We've widened the whole process, and I hope we can keep that and extend it more. So we have 100 and some different ways of connecting people, basically, and we can add to that. We also have several other attributes here which are searchable in the Empress database management system. They're searchable on our old HTML, and they'll be much more searchable on our new data analytical formats. Ici, nous avons les translittérations utilisées dans les textes. Nous avons les deux langues au Canada, et je dois parler un peu français. This is very good for politics. It's good for raising money des gouvernements et de tas de choses. Okay? I'll make that as my token gesture, but that is something to keep in mind. We need to get our French homepage on our site. We created windows. We have dates. Dates are very important in our database, and we have created windows so we can search between numbers. That's an old-fashioned thing. I now show our old-fashioned HTML search form. It still has some virtues. It still has some good things, but it's passé now. We need to move on to the future. So the future includes having full access to the powerful tools of the Empress database management system. They keep it refreshing and improving and so on. And I don't hesitate to mention that in 40 years I have used that system. It has not broken down once. I can't use some other systems, I'm not going to mention names, an afternoon without a breakdown. 40 years. That's how reliable it is, so secure. Now this is some of our formatting to set up our interface, to set up a Google-like search, and we are working on that. I have a team in the Brain Alliance and so on, and we want to improve that, and we want to enhance it and so on. Here we have the adaptation for a new search form, the role of keywords, time, place, and status. In the next one, we have our current result implementation, so the number of attributes selected for name, identifier, and relationship. This is all taken out of the Empress databases. We have a series of those, including a topographical one, and we'll be talking about an epigraphical one. I bring back the old map again, and I show you the pop-ups that we're employing in a new interactive map of Attica. I have it here on the screen. This is a three-dimensional map. It does lots and lots of things that are not possible. I show you some of the vector format. They're dividing into tiles. I have given an inset here of Marathon, and our topographical database is useful here. We can do a number of things with our interactive map. We can click on the place and we get the database on the topography. We can do a second and click on the photo. This comes from a statistic database. This tells us how many representatives. This is quite an amount of material gathered from hundreds of inscriptions. And we can also bring up a modern maps like Google and so on to superimpose on the ancient map. So one we can move. We can also move to the squeezes, and I think I'm coming close to the end. Squeezes are paper impressions of inscriptions. I'm going to pass them around so you have a chance that they've been made for over 400 years. This one has Marathon on it. I was talking about Marathon. They cover all sorts of documents, decrees, laws, gravestones, of course, inventories, lists of women who belong to the equivalent of the Girl Guides 2,500 years ago, all sorts of things. Hardly, we have 50,000 of them from ancient Athens. We made squeezes of them. We're not permitted now because they do damage to the stone, and these can be analyzed York University has used some engineering techniques. I have one on the screen here where we have taken images from 6 different directions. We can enhance that third. They're mildly three-dimensional. We can enhance that. What we're trying to do now is make them available so they be exported to 3D printers. Not yet, but it will come shortly, I hope, very shortly. I move on back to the cup with our technology using n-gram mathematics. We should be able to examine, identify the handwriting, associate fragments which have not been associated. In fact, we should be doing an analysis of Pericles' handwriting here, so we can identify wherever else he wrote, and his brother Arafron, and those other people who belong in the 120,000 we have in our database. That brings us to the end. Telos here. I'm happy to field questions, and do we have any time?
We have a couple minutes for questions.
A couple of minutes for questions, Laura says.